My friend and fellow author Blair Lynn remembers the moment the floor dropped out beneath her. What followed were panic attacks, ER visits, and waves of anxiety so intense they left her trembling, breathless, and afraid she might die. As a Christian, she knew she should cast her cares on God, but she didn't know how. In the depths of fear and discouragement, simple answers and spiritual cliches fell flat. There was no quick fix, no bypassing the valley. In Made to Tremble, Blair shares how she learned to walk with God through her anxiety, not around it. With scripture, story, and raw honesty, she shows what it means to embrace our weakness, not as failure, but as the place where God meets us most tenderly. This is a book for anyone who feels overwhelmed, afraid, or unsure if faith can hold in the storm. Through Blair's story, discover the peace of God and a deeper awe of the God of peace. Get your copy at madetotremble.com. What do you do when it feels like your spiritual life is crumbling? When trusted leaders fail, doubts rise, grief hits, and you don't know what to believe in anymore? In her new book, Someone to Believe In, Embracing the Saviour Who Stays the Same When Everything Else Changes, author and Bible teacher Courtney Reisig helps us to see Jesus' unshakable character. If you're not sure whether you believe in Jesus yet, or if your faith feels unsteady in the face of grieving, burnout, or disillusionment, this book invites you to encounter Jesus as the one who is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Get your copy of Someone to Believe In today at someonetobelievin.com. You're listening to Confronting Christianity, a podcast of Training the Church.
Now here I thought I have someone who's actually making it clear he's going to stay put and answer all my questions. And he doesn't show any sign of getting sick of my questions. And I didn't really realize it, but I have lots of questions. The testimony of Christians around the world is totally overwhelming. I mean, huge proportions of people who become Christian in places like Burma and China, tell investigators that they have done so because of a firsthand experience with healing. I still feel my faith is fragile. At some level, I got to talk myself into it every day. But then I talk to mature Christians who feel the same way. So I think I'm developing a more of a healthy relationship with my doubt.
I'm here with my friend Molly Worthen. Molly is an associate professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where her research focuses on North American religious and intellectual history. In her most recent book, Apostles of Reason, she examines American evangelical intellectual life since 1945, a fascinating topic. She's also a journalist. She's written for the New York Times, the Atlantic, Washington Post, among other outlets. Molly, thank you so much for being with me today.
Thanks for having me.
In the weird remote way that we are with each other when we're actually in completely different states, but
that's right.
At least at the same time. I first heard about you, Molly, or at least I think I may have read some of your writings prior to this. But in August of last year, I got a text from our mutual friend, Pastor J.D. Greear, saying, can I call you for 5 minutes? I want to tell you an amazing story that will really bless you. And he was calling me to tell me that you had become a Christian. So I would love to just start by you sharing a kind of brief version of how that came to be. And then I'm going to probe you further on matters pertaining to history and the central historical claim of the Christian faith. But yeah, give us a little sketch of how it came to be that somebody in your position put their trust in Jesus.
Sure. I grew up in a totally secular home in suburban Chicago, became interested primarily intellectually, but then also personally in religion and particularly Christianity when I went to university, and just began to see that for a huge proportion of the human species over our entire history, for most people, religion has been this incredibly important, if not the important part of the framework through which they move through the world. And I just didn't know anything about it. I think, too, I began to meet people who came out of more traditional Christian or Jewish communities, and I became envious of people who had that community and had answers to the ultimate existential questions. So I spent a long time, I think you could say, trying to sidle up to religion and to various forms of Christianity in the only way I knew how, which was as a very nerdy student. Had some kind of forays into what I would call kind of amateur ethnography. I spent a summer in college living as close as I could to a community of Russian Orthodox Old Believers in kind of the middle of nowhere, Alberta, which was the first time I really began to see what it's like to try to get into the world of people very different from yourself. And that sent me down a path of wanting to be a journalist and just an observer of religion. So I went to graduate school with that in mind. I made a sort of feeble attempt to become an Anglican, didn't really take. And I would say, since that time, I persisted in a mode of dissatisfied, but basically complacent agnosticism. I always thought I would eventually get around to finding a way to become a Christian. Agnosticism didn't seem a very satisfying or tenable long-term posture.
Right.
I thought of myself, I still do think of myself as a pragmatist in kind of the William James mode, which means, at least in theory, holding one's presuppositions lightly, seeing, perfect truth as this asymptote that in our human limitations, we cannot ever totally reach, but we can get closer and closer if we're willing to revise our worldview on the basis of new evidence. So I thought I was kind of in that mode. I thought of myself as someone who was very open to the claims of Christianity. And I guess to the extent that I had themes and a general character to my journalism, it was one of kind of the sympathetic observer who had a practice of giving conservative Christians a fairer shake than I think they were used to getting in the secular media. And certainly then some of my secular liberal readers were used to seeing. But all this said, I wasn't really doing anything about any of this in an active way until I was forced to in spring of 2022. I can tell that story.
Tell me that in a second, but I'm curious, just at that point in your narrative, if you had a sense that maybe one day you might become a Christian, or that there was something there at least that you hadn't quite found but was perhaps discoverable, what would you say were the things that were keeping you from that in that period of your life? What was sort of barriers for you?
I think the main thing, I think this is true of most humans, is that we exist in our existential and epistemological grooves, and they can be very deep. I look back at the introduction to my last book, which is a lot about kind of evangelical worldviews and the theological tradition focused on presuppositions. And in my introduction, I say, yes, of course, all humans have their presuppositions. It's something that I would nod yes to very easily. But in retrospect, I don't think I had ever really taken that truism as an occasion to really interrogate my own presuppositions. So I think the deepest one was an anti-supernaturalist bias. I just think I couldn't get past the way reality is understood in the secular milieu. I've spent the vast majority of my time, which is even if people might pay lip service to this or that conception of the supernatural, really, I'm among people. I'm in a space in which the universe is closed, and so. To the extent that I had really investigated any of the claims of Christianity, which in retrospect, I really hadn't done in a serious way. I mean, that is the hump to get over, right? So I think that was the big reason. But also, I mean, really just to characterize it like that as maybe making it sound too grand. I think a person just gets into certain mental and life habits. And, there was a period in graduate school where I thought, well, if I just go to church, at some point something will happen. But I'd kind of given up on putting myself in the way of the Holy Spirit, I guess.
Fascinating. Okay, sorry, I'll let you carry on now with your story of, I think, where you met J.D. Greear first in the context of an interview, and he sort of gave you some pushes, perhaps out of your comfort or discomforted agnosticism.
That's right. I was working on a magazine article about his church, which is a big mega church with several campuses here in the Raleigh area called The Summit. I'd been working on it for some months, and I had increasingly developed the impression of this church as I went around kind of interviewing, staff and members as a community that prioritized evangelism in a way that I was not used to seeing. I mean, even as someone who spends a fair amount of time talking to evangelicals in my journalistic work, and I want to stress, I have every proper degree of respect for the faith of all the Christians that I've met over the years. But there was something about these summit people where I was like, man, they really believe this stuff. Like, this is just relentless. It kind of caught me off guard. I guess that's the prelude to my when I finally kind of got on JD's calendar to have an interview. He's the fancy head of this big organization, so it took a while. And I thought our conversation would be, I had all these questions prepared about the history of Summit and also the kind of context of Southern Baptist politics. That was my vision for this article I was writing. And we talked a lot about that, but I found myself going off script in a way that I had not intended. I remember one point halfway through the interview asking him, is there any place in your church for people who doubt? I think because I was thinking about this sort of relentless confidence that people in that church express. And he said, why don't you start with a pastor? And he talked about, some of the ways he'd thought about doubt over his life as a Christian. And we kept sort of circling around that. And I guess I sort of outed myself as a seeker type. I hate that word seeker, but it's useful. And he didn't, it's not like he then went into some intense evangelism, let me tell you the 4 spiritual laws mode. That wasn't it at all. But I guess I opened a little bit of a door, and he followed up a few days later with just a message thanking me for my thoughtful questions. And that precipitated a correspondence in which I found myself at first in a sort of a not particularly thoughtful way, tossing questions at him about the truth claims of Christianity and why are the claims about Jesus any more plausible from a historical perspective than the claims of, Joseph Smith or the claims of Muslims about Muhammad and the Quran. And to my surprise, he would respond with very long, thoughtful, detailed answers to my questions, complete with citations and references, always prefaced with, some acknowledgement of how seriously he took my questions and that they were good questions. And even though in retrospect, I'm sure I was asking things that he'd heard a million times, he made me feel immediately like he took me very seriously intellectually. There was nothing condescending about the way he was responding. Sometimes he would say, I would ask a question, he would say, that's a really great question. Let me take a few days and look into it, and I'll get back to you. And I really felt, I was just taken aback. I thought this is like this busy, fancy guy, and he's taking me so seriously. And it kind of dawned on me, wow, I've never been evangelized before, which is a kind of odd thing because I'd had loads of conversations with Christians, but, most people respect the guardrails of our pluralistic society. And, I get it. I think that's generally the right approach. So, the most I had gotten in the past might have been, at the end of an interview, maybe the person would say, what is your own faith background? I would answer, they would say, oh, well, I'll pray for you. But they would leave it there. Now here I thought I have someone who's actually making it clear he's going to stay put and answer all my questions. Yeah. And he doesn't show any sign of getting sick of my questions. And I didn't really realize it, but I have lots of questions. Yeah. And at a certain point I said, I'm an academic. I love homework. Why don't you just give me some books to read? So, he came back with a list of books. Central among them was N.T. Wright's giant book on the resurrection. And I remember ordering it immediately from Amazon and feeling so excited, thinking, could this be the reading list that helps me get there, that helps me find all of this plausible? I think the crucial move that JD made intellectually, it probably sounds pedestrian to people who are Christian, but it had not been to me, was to help me see that Christianity stands or falls on one question, and that is the resurrection of Jesus. I think prior to that, if you're coming to really any world religion cold as an outsider, there's so much complex and frankly crazy supernatural stuff, countercultural stuff too, to take on at once. So in the case of Christianity, it's not just Jesus, but the Bible is full of all of these claims that from the perspective of materialist empiricism are implausible, shall we say. There's the doctrine of heaven and hell. There's all the end times business. There's the sexual ethic that's totally at odds with mainstream secular culture. It becomes for an outsider kind of paralyzing, at least intellectually. And so to be able to see, well, I can put a lot of this stuff to one side and agree to struggle with it. But it's not the central thing. The central thing is this question about a thing that Christians claim happened in history. And I am a historian. And so I have tools to approach it. And I've thought a lot about this, and I've had various arguments with historians, secular and believing, that's kind of clarified my thought. I think if we define the historical method as our ability to draw analogies between our lived experience of cause and effect and how we might conclude cause and effect operated in the past. And then we define a miracle as God's interference or disruption in some way of the natural progress of cause and effect. Then yes, of course, at the singularity of the miracle, the historical method breaks down. Right. So that is to say, you can't prove the resurrection, of course. But I think it turns out, I was learning as I was doing sort of these intense months of reading, N.T. Wright and all sorts of academic articles and people like Richard Bauckham, as well as reading the other side, reading kind of secular skeptics. It turns out that you can certainly use the historical method to get awfully closer than I expected anyway, to that miraculous singularity. And so I began to sense that the chasm between where I was standing and believing that this miracle happened and its implications was getting smaller and smaller. I was also doing, at the same time, I was kind of working on a reading list focused on cosmology, because I was not even a theist. I mean, I had nothing. But I mean, a big book for me was Francis Collins' book, The Language of God, especially when I learned Francis Collins' story and I learned that he too had grown up secular and had become a Christian in medical school. And so that helped me hear him
as well.
That's right. So that was really, I was coming at it from two sides. This is happening over the course of the summer of 2022. I was continuing to go to Summit, this mega church, to my shock, because I had always been a high church snob. I mean, I had been someone who, while I had no certainty on the existence of God, let alone the person of Jesus, I had very strong opinions on liturgy. Right. And so, I always thought, well, when I become a Christian, it'll definitely be kind of high Anglo-Catholic or Catholic or even Orthodox. I can't bear the sort of middle-brow suburban enculturation of Christianity that is the megachurch experience. But I was just continually drawn to this church, having periodic conversations, roughly maybe monthly, with JD, doing this reading. JD connected me with Tim Keller, who was kind enough to talk to me on Zoom a few times and email with me. And that was really encouraging. And he has a very different temperament from JD. So I think that was a helpful balance. But this whole time I was thinking, well, one can't surely become a Christian simply by reading enough footnotes and taking enough, notes in my journal. Surely there has to be like some warm and fuzzy thing that happens internally. I mean, maybe not the lightning bolt of a born again experience, but something. So I was praying for that, and I got nothing. I mean, it was this radio silence. But by the end of the summer, I found that, well, I'm not 99.9% persuaded that the resurrection happened, but I know I am definitely north of 51%. And if I am a consistent pragmatist who is truly open to new information, and if I'm willing to suspend my disbelief in the supernatural, which, the more I investigate it, the more I see that my naturalist worldview was premised on unprovable assumptions. It was premised on a certain blinkered blindness to the experiences of the majority of humans. So there's every reason to at least suspend that disbelief. If I'm willing to do that, then I really do have to confront that the gap between me and Jesus is smaller than the gap behind me. And so it's reasonable to jump I think I found my position as it was untenable. And once you decide you believe a guy rose from the dead, it starts to feel reasonable to say, well, I will submit to him.
Yeah.
And also, I will say I was persuaded by what a few Christians had said to me, which is, okay, Molly, you're saying you want this like magical, lovely feeling in your heart. Sounds like you're describing faith, the relationship. And you can't expect to have that if you haven't entered the relationship.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that also made me willing to kind of take the leap. But I will stress, it was not a conventional born again experience, at least as I had romanticized it. I still feel my faith is fragile. At some level, I got to talk myself into it every day. But I talk to mature Christians who feel the same way, right? So I think I'm developing a more of a healthy relationship with my doubt.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's increasingly clear to me is that a lot of the time people think they're comparing Christianity with all the sort of crazy beliefs about, somebody rising from the dead, etc., miracles, whatnot, to a perfectly coherent secular worldview that does all the work that Christianity does for you without having to believe in crazy things. And actually there isn't that alternative. Like I think sometimes Christians are in the position of wanting to say, oh, no, Christianity is like not crazy. It's perfectly reasonable to be a Christian. And I'd sort of want to say, well, actually Christianity is crazy, but show me the alternative that's less crazy. Like really, if we look holistically at all the sort of explanatory power of Christianity compared to what secularism has to offer. It was interesting to hear you talking about the ground that you're sort of standing on, feeling increasingly closer to Christianity than to the agnosticism that you'd sort of felt wasn't satisfying. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's absolutely right.
Yeah. So thinking about this question in particular of the resurrection, you said that you became persuaded at least 51% or north of 51% that Jesus of Nazareth did actually rise from the dead. Give us just a sort of a couple of data points in that progression for you. What pieces of evidence were you maybe surprised by or intrigued by or most persuaded by as you considered that question?
Yes. Well, I think N.T. Wright's argument, in his book on the resurrection and the Son of God, he makes this detailed study of pagan and Second Temple Jewish milieus to describe what the idea of resurrection did and did not mean, to the immediate predecessors of the first Christians. And so, he gives you this portrait of the ideas that were floating around. And, this is in the context, I think, of a body of scholarship in which secular or sort of more kind of metaphorically inclined Christian scholars tend to really equate Christian claims about Jesus' resurrection with, the ancient Greek stories of gods dying and rising again, and these other kind of mythological lines. I found N.T. Wright's argument that those analogies are really they sort of fall apart on closer examination to be pretty persuasive. I mean, he argues that coming back from the dead was not something that dead messiahs, of which there were a few, did at this time. When there were a lot of self-nominated saviors running around. And he simply persuaded me of the sheer weirdness of the resurrection, that this is not something that Jesus' followers would have expected. Yeah. And that if we had only in our evidence the empty tomb, which I'll say there are some scholars who dispute that Jesus was buried in a tomb and so forth, but the consensus is he was buried in a tomb. Or if we had only the reports of Jesus' appearances to his disciples, either of these by themselves would not have yielded the early Christian belief in the risen Messiah. But that since we've got both, there's reason to take them seriously. And in combination, they are the only reason, they're the only reasonable explanation for this belief. And that, efforts by kind of post-Enlightenment scholars to mythologize these stories, to read them as later Christian beliefs imposed on the past, to say that witnesses in the Gospels engaged in kind of wish fulfillment based on dreams or special feelings they had about their experience with Jesus, that this is really what C.S. Lewis called chronological snobbery, and that it doesn't take seriously the sophisticated way in which first century Middle Easterners navigated their world. And this really hit me, as a historian who's always thought of myself as someone who does not condescend to the past. Yeah. For it to be gently pointed out that maybe I had been doing that, it was a real prick to my conscience. And, I also was reading just a lot of sort of biblical criticism and realizing that there's this whole world of really smart kind of Anglican, evangelical, biblical scholarship that's come out in the past 20 years that I just think a lot of secular people, even in academia, are not really aware of.
Yeah, the Richard Bauckhams of the world in particular.
Yeah, and there's a kind of interesting story here. I think it has to do with the ecosystem of publishing houses and the incentives for these really excellent Christian scholars to publish with Christian presses, because that imprimatur means their books will sell better, to the audiences that really want them. But one consequence of that is that it kind of heightens the walls between this Christian scholarship and people who don't necessarily share those presuppositions. But I came to see that when I was in graduate school, I cannot blame this in any way on the faculty at Yale or the Yale Divinity School, because I think they were all kind of Orthodox Christians. And I was not a div student, but I think I just sort of absorbed from the ether what I now see is a pretty outdated kind of Jesus seminar set of ideas about the mythologization of Jesus. And, what I mean by that is a kind of middle 20th century, group of liberal scholars who came to be known as the Jesus Seminar, went through the Gospels and came up with this very short list of, the very few passages that they deemed were reliably, connectable to the person of Jesus. And, everything else is miasma of, cultural accretions. And who knows, we have to sort of get through that. And what we're left with is this sort of kernel of someone who certainly didn't claim he was Messiah and, may not have even done these various miracles, did not think he was the Son of God. But, as I read into it, I became persuaded that, in fact, a lot of that has been pretty thoroughly challenged. Yeah. So I was coming to be more and more persuaded of the value of the Gospels as historical records. And I'm not talking about being persuaded of inerrancy. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I'm still sort of figuring out what I exactly believe about how we should think about the authority of the Bible. But I think, in my process, when I was not yet a Christian, I became persuaded that even if I simply treat the Gospels as historical documents, on the same level as any other set of historical documents, allowing that, they're created by humans, they may have errors, even if we allow all of that, they still yield really interesting evidence that I need to wrestle with.
The Sing hymnal, from award-winning hymn writers Keith and Kristen Getty, is a rich collection of classic and contemporary hymns created to deepen worship, foster unity in the church, and proclaim the hope that we have in Christ. Alongside beloved hymns, you'll also find psalms paired with songs, liturgical readings, and helpful indices, making this hymnal a lasting resource for families and congregations alike. Pick up your copy wherever books are sold, or get 30% off at crossway.org/Getty hymnal with a free Crossway Plus account. One of the points that Richard Bauckham makes that I find sort of devastatingly useful in terms of thinking about a lot of the liberal scholarship that's happened in the last sort of 50 years or so is that a lot of it's happened on the almost tacit assumption that the first witnesses, the eyewitnesses of Jesus' life, death and resurrection, sort of somehow disappeared right after. That there wasn't, none of them actually lived long enough to be able to be telling their stories. And it was all sort of passed on through some kind of telephone game-like whispers down the chain until finally the Gospels are written down, when in fact the Gospels are being written down in the lifetimes of the eyewitnesses. And it's almost like there's been this assumption that we can't possibly be getting legitimate access to eyewitness accounts of Jesus from the Gospels, when in fact, purely from an historical perspective, there's no reason to think that we're not. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think that's right. I remember I spent a couple of weekends deep in the database that my university has access to that allows me to read, all the academic journal articles on this stuff. And there were a few roundtable discussions of N.T. Wright's book, drawing together scholars who were both very critical and those who were persuaded, and some were in between, and kind of reading other stuff in that realm. And I came away with the reluctant conclusion that all of these scholars started out with their preformed presuppositions about what they would find, And the evidence is such, and our distance, of 2,000 years is such that you can find what you seek to find. And that sounds like a pedestrian thing to say. And to some extent, it is true of any debate over anything interesting in history. But I think the debate over the resurrection is an extreme example of the way in which scholars' presuppositions really form what they see in the evidence.
Yeah.
And so, I was disappointed to find that. I thought, wow, I will never get clarity. But it was also, I guess it was also liberating in a sense, or it told me that, there were limits to what I could find in just sort of reading book after book. Although I'm on that quest. I'm still kind of obsessed with apologetics. I still think like there's that one book out there that if I just read it, it will make all my doubts go away.
What would you say then, Molly, to someone who said, look, I know that as an academic or as somebody who's, got a strong academic background, I know that I'm starting with a presupposition that there is no supernatural kind of intervention in the world, whether it's in science or history or, philosophy, ethics, whatever. I know I'm starting with that presupposition. But honestly, that just is the presupposition on which intellectual life proceeds. Like if somebody just said to you, sure, I'm assuming there's no God, but so is everybody else who's really doing academic work. How would you respond to somebody saying that?
That's a great question. I'm trying to think of what chipped away at that for me. I think it was a process of first thinking more and more about the fact, which was not new to me, that there are loads of people doing very respectable, elite work in secular academia with all the fancy degrees who are Christian. And I'd always, I'm not someone who came at this with like a lot of condescension toward Christianity in that sense. But I suppose once I allowed it to, that gave me permission maybe to be open. I guess I had become disillusioned with the ability of my secular pragmatist, functionally materialist worldview to really provide a foundation for the things that I wanted to be firmly grounded, mainly individual human dignity and human rights. And so I guess I would advise a person, coming from my background to really interrogate that, to look at the moral values that you find non-negotiable and do some serious reading in Enlightenment philosophy, in Kant and kind of the various secular or kind of proto-secular post-Protestant efforts to try to build an edifice to support that. Maybe you find it convincing. I had hope in it for a long time, but I found it less convincing in the past 5 or 10 years, I suppose, in part because of, I don't know, the attenuation of liberal values and behavior in academia and the kind of collapse of our ability in secular academia to really, I think, have a lot of honest conversations that entertain disagreement. Then there's a piece of this that I didn't really engage in until right after I converted. I wonder what it would have done for me if I had gone down this path before my conversion. It still has been super important for me. And that was a serious investigation of claims regarding miraculous healing here and now in our contemporary world. This is something I just turned a blind eye to. I just never had looked into it. But, the testimony of Christians around the world is totally overwhelming. Huge proportions of people who become Christian in places like Burma and China, tell investigators that they have done so because of a firsthand experience with healing. And I had in the course of my research, I had a few conversations with primarily Josh and Candy Brown, who are academics who teach at Indiana University. She's in religious studies. He's a neuroscientist. And they've recently begun to be more open about their personal experience with divine healing. Josh believes he was miraculously healed of terminal brain cancer. And they have done, for their whole kind of academic careers, they've had this side career of getting as close as it's really possible to get to really rigorous empirical investigation of miraculous claims and kind of healing revivals in places like rural Mozambique. And, I had a phone conversation with both of them I had to hear them. I mean, they're in my milieu. They've done all their training in secular universities. They have, tenure. They've played the game. They know how the game works, and they're not from some totally alien culture of, people who've grown up with Pentecostal beliefs about healing. They're from a place I recognize, and talking to them and hearing their stories and being forced to really take them seriously. Talking also to, I had a really powerful conversation with a man named Ifeanyi Chinedozie, who is finishing a fellowship in cardiovascular surgery at Johns Hopkins. So he's a very serious, science-minded guy, but he grew up as a child healing evangelist in Nigeria, and he still runs an international healing ministry. And talking to him as someone who resides in both worlds and really sees the limitations of the secular blindness to the miraculous, it really shook me. And it compelled me, if not to necessarily believe, in every claim, right, to at least recognize the limitations of my own experience, the real limitations of, what is basically David Hume's argument against miracles. I mean, this is when you hear arguments that this stuff can't happen, you're usually just hearing kind of rehashed David Hume. Yeah. And one of the things David Hume says is, well, yeah, there are all these reports about like crazy stuff happening, but those are all savages, right? And it's just interesting to me that, at a cultural moment when secular liberals want so much to hear the voices of the global South, to decenter Western prejudices, here is one area in which they are very uncomfortable decentering Western prejudices. Yeah. So I ended up writing an article about this, but I think that is a vein of inquiry, of reading, that I would encourage secular people to pursue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's fascinating. Last question. If somebody said to you, which perhaps they have, listen, Molly, I'm so glad for you that you've found something that works and that you believe in Jesus. Great. 2 thumbs up. I hope it makes you happy. It's just not for me. I'm pursuing another path to truth. How would you respond to somebody who basically saw the Christian faith as something that, lovely for you, but actually I don't need that. I can go a different way.
It's just one option. There are many paths up the mountain. Yeah. And I think that's the mindset I encounter among many of my Christian students. I think the culture kind of trains us in that. Suppose there is I don't think that the proper response to that is a kind of hostile confrontation. I think my approach, which is my approach to most conversations, would be to probe, to ask, how are you pursuing that? What are your questions? What are you reading? What is the, when you talk about your own truth, what are the consequences of that? I think, evangelism, there's maybe 2 layers of answer to your question. One is the sort of philosophical response, but then the other is what works at a personal level to actually have these conversations, because you can lay out what you might perceived to be a totally airtight argument that, if you think of everything as, choosing your own truth, but you want to affirm, the inviolability of universal human rights, you have to confront a tension at the heart of those two claims. You can lay that out on paper, but that is not going to persuade a person. I mean, certainly in my kind of incompetent attempts to have some of these conversations among my friends and family and colleagues who are overwhelmingly secular, I have found that there's a point at which people will sort of lose interest in having the argument, and they'll move to a place of saying, well, it just sort of works. It works in whatever we've got right now, this kind of secular post-Christian thing. They're usually uncomfortable, with the assertion that they live on borrowed Christian assumptions. That tends to annoy people. Yeah. But they will sort of lose interest in the intellectual argument by insisting that it works. The evangelistic approach, just the human approach, I don't want to say evangelistic, because I think that can be heard as like an instrumental approach to your relationships with people who don't share your worldview, is one of friendship and making it clear that you're sort of genuinely curious about how other people see the world. I mean, when I think about the conversations that I had with JD and other Christians who helped me along this path, it was premised on just a real confidence that we enjoyed each other's company and valued each other's ideas about the world and held our own claims with a real humility. Mm-hmm. And I guess I still go into every conversation with Christians and non-Christians, I hope, at least this is what I aspire to, on the assumption that I can learn. I have a lot to learn about my own beliefs from this person, whether or not they agree with me. And also, I think one thing that I hear again and again from mature Christians, at least in the kind of more reformed circles that I tend to be in, is it's not up to you. God's plan for every individual, and whether or not they come to Christianity, that is not up to you. And there are certain opportunities or jobs, you may have in a person's life that will help them, but you are one part of a bigger story. And when I think about my own path, I mean, yes, like there was this intense period of a few months where a couple of individuals and a few big books and a very discrete process seemed to be the turning point. But from another angle, it took me 20 years, mm-hmm. and there were so many moving pieces, all of which were important. And so I think going into any conversation with that attitude kind of takes the pressure off.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I was talking with a friend a little while ago who's sort of been exploring faith and was saying, what do you think I should do? And we're at a point in our relationship where I now can be sort of very, very open with her. So, what I said was, I think you should repent and believe in Jesus today. But if that takes days, weeks, months, years, I'm here for all of that. Like, I am not going anywhere. I would love to continue talking with you and as best I can, pointing you to Jesus through that process as you contemplate his claims. And I remember you helpfully commenting a conversation we had, I think, a couple of months ago, where you'd said, listening to somebody who had some very legitimate reasons to actually discredit Christianity, you were thinking, well, be that as it may, what does that actually have to do with the question of whether Jesus rose from the dead? And that for you, like, actually it all boils down to that at the end of the day, that he either did or he didn't. And if he did, then there's no limit to the implications of that. And if he didn't, then actually Christianity is dead in the water. So
that's right. I have realized that there are two kinds of people. There are people who are naturally interested in metaphysics and see those as fundamental questions that you can't avoid. They really are bothered by the mystery around the origin of the universe. And then there are a lot of people for whom these questions are beside the point. And I will say that the people in that latter camp are not necessarily secular. I think a lot of people who are deeply pious, I mean, they're religious, their sense of confidence in the truth claims, their commitment to this life, it derives from other sources. It derives from their relationship to their community and the trust they have in that. So it's not that it's a secular and religious divide, but I think I have run into this reality again and again, because I am obsessed with metaphysics and very focused on it. But I'll initiate these conversations with people who are not of that mind, and their eyes just glaze over. I mean, I had a dear friend, after hearing my story, she said, "Wait, the only thing that was keeping you from being a Christian was the question of whether or not Jesus rose from the dead?" And she was sort of mystified. And so I see that, in many cases, the important thing is to just kind of live alongside people and show that you're, yes, I've converted to accept what are, from the perspective of the, kind of empiricist, materialist worldview, a set of crazy beliefs, but I'm still a normal person. So, I can my testimony is just like being a normal person and not being in some crazy cult. I hope what Christians say about like sanctification and the evidence in your life is all true as well. And to then, couple that with a willingness to just have conversations like this one when the opportunities arise. So I don't think the answer is to never testify with your mouth, but to just see the two as inseparable.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much, Molly, for taking the time to have this conversation. I really appreciate it. And I'm sure our Listeners have appreciated hearing you as well. You've been listening to the Confronting Christianity podcast. You can follow us on Twitter or Instagram, or you can leave us a review on iTunes. You can also include a question you'd like to see explored in a future episode, and we'll take that into consideration. Please join me next week when I'll be talking with a friend who's written a book on the Old Testament book of Ecclesiastes. We'll be talking about Thanksgiving and the futility of life. Until then.